Good morning, everybody. I want to welcome you all to this month's EfD seminar. And it is a pleasure for us as part of SETI to welcome Maximiliane Sievert. Maximiliane, for those of you who doesn't know her, Maximiliane is the co-head of the Department of Climate and Development Policy at the Leibniz Institute for Economic Research in Germany. She has a vast experience in the topic that she will be presenting today, electrification. She has been working in this topic for many years since her education during his PhD studies. And Maxi has been a pivotal member of the SETI collaborative program, serving as member of the steering committee since 2020, and is a great asset to us in SETI. So today, Maxi will discuss how she will present us her work, and this work she is about to present is linked to the current efforts at SETI, which will be very enlightening thinking of the next years of SETI research. So I just want to warmly welcome Maxi. So the floor is yours, Maxi.
Thank you very much. Let me quickly share my slides with you. That works. Okay, can you see my slides? Great.
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, welcome also from my side, and thank you very much for this very kind introduction. I'm very happy to present this work today here to the EfD community, because it's the latest of a number of research projects that we have been doing on electrification in Rwanda. And we have presented the results of the earlier studies extensively at EfD meetings, or particularly in SETI meetings. So for those of you who have been part of this group for a while, you might recognize some of the findings and some of the papers that I'm going to present here in the next hour. But I also have new results from the latest RC2 that we have been doing on entrepreneurial grants. So I hope there will be new and interesting insights for everybody. Okay, so the research I'm going to present is joint work, most importantly with Lise Marcellus. It's part of her PhD thesis, and she has been doing most of the work in this research project. And my co-authors are Anisette Mounier here, we're based in Rwanda, Nathan Fiala from University of Connecticut, and Jörg Ankel Peters, who's also based at RWI in Germany. And what I'm going to talk about now in this presentation is results from a randomization that we did together with the government of Rwanda. And this policy of the government of Rwanda tries to foster productive electricity uptake, right? So it tries to incentivize households and micro-enterprises to use electricity for productive purposes. And this policy has been designed upon the insight that over the last decade, we have been seeing that development effects, particularly economic development effects of grid electrification projects, have rather been small, right? And in order to reduce already a bit the tensions of what we found. So this program has been very well received. So people participated, it has been delivered to the beneficiaries, but also with this project, we do not really see noteworthy economic development effects. And what we are doing here, to give you some details on what I think is particularly nice of this research study that we have been doing.
See, I'm so sorry to interrupt. We are now looking at your presenter view, but you are still on the first slide. So perhaps you have the full screen mode.
Okay, that's strange.
We are still looking at the presenter's view.
Okay, maybe that's a problem because I have connected that's
perfect now.
Yeah, okay, let's see. Now my camera is off. Let me see if I can switch on my camera. Okay, you still see me, hear me, and see my slides? Okay. Right. Okay, so yeah, what I was saying, so the nice feature of this RCT is, as I said, it's the latest in a series of impact evaluations. So it builds upon our work that we have been doing over the last 10 to 15 years in Rwanda. And now let's see. Yeah. And with this intervention, we try to understand a bit what might be reasons why we don't see effects of economic development effects of rural electrification in Rwanda. It is a real world policy that we have been implementing together with the government of Rwanda, but we try to look at this policy intervention from a theoretical perspective and try to apply economic theory of what we would expect to happen. And it also speaks to the scientific literature that many of you might know that is substantially divided. And I'm going to talk about this in more detail now in the next minutes. So on the policy background, I guess in this community, I don't have to talk too much about it. I think we are all aware that we still have today almost 700 million people lacking access to electrification, and most of them are located in sub-Saharan Africa, right? As you can see here on the graph, over the last decade, we have seen substantial improvements in access to electricity in many world regions, and also in sub-Saharan Africa, we have seen progress on the number of people connected to electricity, but population growth has outpaced, or the growth in electricity access has not been able to outpace population growth. Energy access is high on the political agenda. We have, most importantly, the SDG 7 that aims to connect or to provide access to electricity to everybody. But of course, this comes as a cost, right? So providing electricity to, particularly in rural areas, is very costly. And if we look at the motivation that how these huge investment costs are legitimized, it is mainly about economic development effects, right? So particularly if we look at the newest initiative by World Bank and EfD, the Mission 300, it clearly states that it aims to connect people to electricity, and what is the goal? To lift them out of energy poverty and drive economic growth, right? So we clearly have this agenda of incentivizing economic growth through rural electrification. And in Rwanda, the big policy effort to bring electricity to rural areas is the Electricity Access Rollout Program, EARP. It has been very effective in providing access to electricity. So it started around 2010 with less than 5% of the population with access to electricity. And today we have more than 50% connected or with electricity access, right? So either connected to the grid or through off-grid sources. And now looking at the literature, we see that we have an early strand of the literature from the 2010s, where we see substantial impacts of electrification on economic development. Right, so probably the two most important papers are here, the one by Lipskop, Mubarak, and Barham in Brazil that document economic growth through electrification, and the other one, the paper in AER by Taryn Dinkelman, that also documents economic development effects. So these papers are largely based on instrumental, or these two are definitely based on instrumental variables. And so they are on Brazil, as I said, and South Africa, which is maybe a particular case in sub-Saharan Africa, right? And then we have the second strand of the literature, which is newer and also applies other identification designs. And these papers rather find muted impacts. So we have, for example, the paper by Burlik and Preonas in India that do not find substantial impacts. And then also in Sub-Saharan Africa, Kenya, the Lee et al. Paper. And also one of these papers that that emerged from my group on rural electrification in Rwanda. And, right, and I'm going to talk about our work a bit more in detail now. So the paper that I want to present here today builds on the series of policy evaluation that we have been doing in Rwanda. And we started with the first phase of this EARP program in 2009. And here we evaluate socioeconomic impacts of this policy endeavor. And what we find is that people are super happy when they get electricity. So people want electricity. People also want grid electricity. And it also improves their life, right? So we see people adopt electric lighting, people adopt entertainment appliances like radios or TVs, and it improves access to information. It also gives people higher flexibility to organize their daily duties, so they extend the time under light. But we also see that we hardly see any productive uptake, right? So hardly any appliances that can be used productively, and we see overall very low consumption levels. And we also see, even though in theory everybody has access to electricity, everybody could connect to the electricity grid, and the government also had made substantial efforts to get people to connect to the electricity grid by, for example, reducing the connection fee or offering payment in installment for the connection fee. We see connection rates that are clearly below 100%. So, and when we presented this paper to policymakers or also to the scientific community, what we often heard was that, okay, it might be possible that after 3.5 years, this was a time horizon in this paper, maybe that's not enough time for impacts to materialize, right? And this idea is also well aligned with economic theory, right? So here I'm quoting from the Carter and Barrett paper on on poverty traps. And the idea is that potentially it takes time for people to save in order to be able to invest into productive assets that can then be used in order to generate economic growth, right? So what we did is we went back to the same villages that we already surveyed in the first study and went back 10 years after electrification to see how adoption developed over time. This is a current working paper for the moment. And what we see is that also 10 years after electrification, we still see consumption that is rather low. So both among households and enterprises, the consumption level has not really increased. Yeah, so here I have a graph from this paper where we compare the consumption level among households in 2013. So this was around around 3 years after electrification. And then the panel B is in the year 2022, where we see that consumption definitely did not increase. If anything, it might have decreased even a bit. And also, if we look at connection rates and appliance ownership, we see the same picture, right? So regarding connection rates in 2015, we already had around 80% of households that were living next to the electricity grid connected. And in 2022, we see more or less the same picture, right? So still quite high connection rates of 80%, but it's not everybody who connects to the electricity grid. And if we try to look at the wider community, so all households, also those who are not located immediately next to the electricity grid, we see connection rates of only 50%. So clearly not universal uptake of electricity. And if we look at appliance ownership, we see that households invest into certain appliances, and this happens more or less immediately after electrification, right? So we have mobile phones, many households using mobile phones. We also have radios, and then to a lower extent, also TVs, computers, electric irons, refrigerator, hardly anybody uses. And over time, we really don't see any development. Right. And this was on households, and we also interviewed micro enterprises, and here we see a similar picture, right? So most enterprises connect to the grid, but we hardly see any electric appliances that are used for productive purposes, right? So most enterprises also use lighting or use some entertainment devices, but no productive appliances, or very few productive appliances. So as our interim conclusion, and before starting now the new research project, we saw that in Rwanda, so our data obviously speaks of Rwanda, but this is in line with evidence from other sub-Saharan African countries, that rural electrification is not a driver of transformative economic development. And this, of course, is problematic if we think about the policy goal of providing electricity in order to generate economic growth, right? Because the productive use, as I was arguing in the beginning, productive use and transformative economic effects are at the bottom of the motivation of these investments into rural electrification. So we've been wondering also in many occasions together with EfD people in the SETI meetings, so what might be reasons why we don't see more productive use of electricity? And there are potential reasons, for example, that electricity is simply not the decisive bottleneck, right? So these rural communities in sub-Saharan Africa are often so disconnected from other services like transportation, roads, access to finance, that potentially electricity is not the one bottleneck that will kickstart economic development. And it is hardly integrated into markets. So increased production, if it is enabled by electricity, cannot be transferred into higher incomes because these rural areas are so poorly connected to bigger markets. And what we often heard, particularly from the policy side, is that there might be an additional reason, or that the other reasons are not so important, but maybe it would help to just generate a bigger push at the micro level. So to provide other complementary inputs, and then it might be possible to kickstart economic development. So this is what we are testing here in this new study. And we test whether we can, by providing entrepreneurial grants to households and micro enterprises, whether this can unleash local economic development if these are provided to communities that are connected to the electricity grid. So households and enterprises in our study could apply for in-kind grants of up to $1,000, right? So it's quite a substantial grant that has been provided, and they could apply for electric appliances. And if we think about this program, that is a program by the government of Rwanda, if we think about this from an economic theory perspective, this is well in line with this idea of poverty traps, right? So if you imagine that in these villages you have two productive activities, one is a low return activity that is here in the graph, that would be activity L1, and a higher return activity L2. If households have a certain level of assets, that here in the graph would be the asset level below AS, they can only engage in the low return economic activity. And now the question is, normally households, enterprises should be or might be able to reach a higher equilibrium by switching to the high return activity if they are able to, for example, save money and invest these into more appliances, right? As we were seeing in the beginning, so maybe it just takes more time to accumulate assets. or they could borrow money and invest into assets. But potentially these households and these villages, these micro enterprises are so constrained that they are not able to switch from this low return production to the high return production. And this, but it might be possible through now an external grant, leapfrogging households and firms from the low equilibrium to a better equilibrium by endorsing them with assets, right? So this is what we are testing here. And in policy terms, the question is whether we can force enterprises, households to use electricity productively if we just inject enough money. Okay, and we are doing this together with the government of Rwanda through the CEAP program. So it is a program that is complementing the rural electrification effort in Rwanda. It's called Scaling Up Energy Access Program, CEAP, and it's co-funded by EfD and the Green Environmental Facility, and it has been launched in 2014. And as I said already, so the idea is to support grid-connected communities to start income-generating activities using electricity, right? And in this program, individuals could apply for grants up to 1,000 US$, and per village, these grants were given at, it was the maximum amount per village was 1,500 US$. Okay, and how do we look at this intervention? So in the first, in the beginning, we wrote a quite detailed pre-analysis plan, and we defined as our primary impact indicator whether households increase electricity consumptions, or the applicants, the electricity consumption of applicants. This is our primary outcome. And then as a secondary outcome, we look at firm profits of these beneficiaries and the employment of the beneficiaries. And we specified that only if we see results on the primary and secondary indicators that we would then explore spillovers to the community level, right? Then we might expect that there are also spillovers to other enterprises that might be positive or negative, and to the wider community in terms of household impacts. And thinking about statistical power for the three main outcomes that I have just been naming, so electricity consumption, firm profits, and employment, we are okay powered. So the minimum detectable effect size might seem high if you look at the numbers, but if you compare it to the baseline level, it seems reasonable, right? So you see electricity consumption is super low at baseline, and a 100% increase in electricity consumption, for example, would only mean an increase by around 4 to 5 kilowatt hours per month, right? But of course, for spillovers and for looking at mechanism, our study is not very well powered. But at least the three main indicators are well powered. Okay, so how did this experiment look like? So we sampled together with the program a total of 84 villages, nicely distributed across almost all Rwanda, rural Rwanda. We randomized at the village level. And the eligibility criteria for these villages were that they had to have electricity connection since at least 2018. So all these villages have had electricity already for some years. We did not go to the most remote villages. So we tried to identify villages that had at least some business activity already at baseline, let's say. And of course, no complementary grant or credit programs for electric appliances. And then in the next step, we went to all 84 villages and started the grant application process here, right? So all our villages in the sample went to this application process, and the randomization only took place afterwards. And this application process worked through the program staff that worked together with village leaders and in village meetings where they explained the program and where they introduced the population to very simple templates that had to be filled out in order to apply for electric appliances, right? And the micro enterprises or households were assisted from SEAP staff to fill out these templates. The applicants, the applications could be submitted directly after the meeting or within 1 month after the meeting. Right, after the meeting. And then the selection took place by right, so I was about to explain the timeline, right? So what is important, I think I already said this, we selected the communities and did the call for proposals, and only afterwards we did the randomization, right? So we selected potentially successful applications, both in treatment and control, or like in the whole population of villages where we performed these business this application process. Then we collected baseline data, and only afterwards we did the randomization. And the randomization was done in public in these communities, okay? And we collected endline data around 1 year after baseline, after implementation of after delivering the electric appliances to the villages. Right, and now coming to the results. Right, here you see a few pictures of the moment when the SEAP staff handed over the electric appliances, and you will already see that these are like typical appliances that are often used also in remote areas in rural Africa, right? So you have like fridges or television, sewing machines, and some agricultural processing machines. And here I have an overview of the most frequent appliances that have been distributed. So you see that most appliances are rather low energy consuming appliances, like, for example, razors or sewing machines. We have quite some appliances used in hairdresser salons, right? So we also have hairdressing helmets and curling irons. Some few appliances that using more electricity, like welding machines or maize millers. But you see already, like, there are no appliances that you would think, oh wow, that's new for these rural economies, right? It's rather appliances that can be found in many rural areas in sub-Saharan Africa. Right, and now I'm already coming to the results. And here, it's important to distinguish two different levels of impacts. So most households had more than one business activity. So either the same person or different persons in the household run different businesses. And this is why we estimate the impacts in a first step on the level of the applicant business. And then afterwards, we look at the whole household and look at all businesses, at all economic activities within the household, right? And if we only look at the applicant businesses, we see that we have clear impacts on electricity consumption, but also on profits, and some smaller effects on employment. We measure it on the one hand as a dummy, whether they have any employees at all, and then the number of employees in full-time equivalents. But then if we look at all businesses in the households, we see that the effects on electricity consumption persist, but on profits, the size of the effect is substantially smaller and it's not significant. And also for employment, the size of the effect diminishes. It's still there, but only on the dummy variable, right? So we apparently see some reorganization or crowding out of existing businesses within households, right? So those who did not get the grant, did not get the appliances that they applied for, apparently engaged in a different business activity where they make similar profits as with the one that they applied for. Right, and because, as I said in the beginning, in the pre-analysis plan, we said only if we see substantial impacts on this primary and secondary outcomes, we would explore spillovers. Since we don't see real impacts here on this level, we don't explore spillovers further. And so our interpretation is now that apparently this intervention was not successful, right? So we injected substantial amount of money, up to $1,500 per village, but we see very modest impacts only. And I mean, somehow you can argue that it's possible to make people use electricity for income generation, right? So we somehow succeeded in making people use electricity for income generation, but this doesn't mean that this leads to higher profits. Right, and now coming back again to the big picture that I was alluding to in the beginning. So what does it, so how confident are we that what we see in Rwanda is somehow representative for other rural areas in sub-Saharan Africa? We believe that this is not particular to Rwanda, that because also in other sub-Saharan Africa, we see that in newly connected areas, we have low electricity consumption. And we also had a look at the data from the multi-tier framework data that are, of course, only households, but at the household level, we also see that appliance uptake in other countries among connected households is rather low. And particularly here in this group, there might be some of you who are aware of this very nice paper by Robert Fetter and Faraz Usmani, who show that in India, in certain villages, we did see economic development that was only possible because these villages had electricity. And this is somehow similar to this idea that we were testing here in this study, right? So if there's an external push, maybe then electrification can unfold its growth potential. And so our study is in contrast to what Rob and Faraz find in India. And potentially it's simply not the same, right? If you have an naturally occurring macro big push versus this big push that we were studying here that was artificially injected. So potentially thinking of the poverty trap in our villages, this high return activity did simply not exist, right? So we weren't able to push them to any higher productive activity that apparently exists in the case of India and the fracking boom. Right, and summing up now, we have seen that providing enterprises and households with grants to invest into electric appliances did not have the expected impacts. So this means that even if we inject considerable money and targeted money into villages after connection to the electricity grid, it is difficult to kickstart economic development, right? And this, of course, doesn't mean that electrification cannot lead to economic development somewhere, as we see, for example, in the case of India. But it decreases our prior that just by providing electricity, it will generate economic growth everywhere, right? And this is how I would like to conclude and to stop. And thank you very much for your attention. And I'm looking forward to your comments or questions.
Thank you very much, Maxi, for your excellent presentation. We still have some time for discussion, so please, comments and questions to Maxi. I saw in the chat that Annalie has a clarification question. I don't know whether you want to follow up on your comment.
Thanks, Marcella. Hi, Maxi. This is Anjali here. I'm from EfD, the Global Hub in Gothenburg. My questions were a little more basic. My first was, and this is because I don't know the definition of how Rwanda defines electricity access. For example, in India, traditionally it was if 10% of the village has access, and that is very minimal, which is one tube light or an electric fan running. If 10% of the households in a village have access, the village is qualified as access to electricity. I don't know if it's changed over the past couple of years with the new government, but I was wondering how that's for Rwanda. That was my first question. And the second is, and maybe I've not caught it very well in the presentation, on what is your parameters for assessing impact on economic development? Because you see that you assess the electricity consumption, which is also stated, if I'm not wrong, and how much profits a particular business makes. Are those the criteria for judging whether there has been an impact on economic development, or is there something else? Thanks. We are muted.
Yeah, I realized. Okay. Yeah, thank you for these comments. So I'm not completely sure anymore how exactly the government of Rwanda defines electricity access. I believe that they count as long as the electricity grid reaches a village, this village is counted as having access to electricity. So it doesn't mean that everybody in this village has electricity. And I think this is how they calculate the 54% of electrification rate. But I'm not 100% sure. I somehow remember that it's like this. And then your question on how to measure economic development, of course, that's debatable, like which dimensions we should measure if we think about impacts of electricity. And I hope I have been clear in my presentation that there are, of course, also other dimensions that are influenced by electrification, right? So what we already saw after 3 years of electrification, we saw that people were using electricity and that they were that this was giving flexibility to households that could in the longer run also lead to economic development impacts, right? Like the people could use this time to improve education, to invest into activities that might in the longer run then also lead to economic development. But if we think about directly measuring, and I mean we are looking at in the long run paper 10 years after electrification, we believe that you would have to see somehow that micro enterprises or households should earn profits, right? And of course, it maybe households are employed in industries, but we would see this in our data too, right? So we also have household data, and if they were employees of other bigger firms, we would see this too. But what's happening in the villages, we definitely cover this through business profits.
Prisha.
Yes, thank you very much. Do you hear me, Charlie?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I'm Fasaha from SREC and EfD Ethiopia. So yeah, it's a really interesting study. Just I would like to give 2 comments, I would say. The first one is, have you checked in terms of understanding the reasons why they are not using electricity this much? So have you checked if there are alternative energy sources and what was the role of price in terms of reducing energy consumption? Somehow I feel like it might be related to affordability for households in sub-Saharan Africa. And the other aspect is it might be related to the first question, but when you say economic development, from my understanding, in your study, you only include electricity consumption and as well as some sort of profitability and entrepreneurship, I would say. So that's good. But if we look at the broad the broad perspective in sub-Saharan African context, we expect economic development to be mostly driven by agricultural productivity, and the role of electricity in agricultural transformation is quite important, and I think your study didn't account for that. Without that, can we strongly really conclude that electrification may not have an economic development impact? So if there is any feedback related to that, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the first question on affordability, of course, it might be the reason that that electricity consumption is just too expensive for people to use this in their businesses. But so what I can say, the electricity tariffs in Rwanda are not higher than in other sub-Saharan African countries. So it wouldn't be a reason that particularly in Rwanda you have so high tariffs that this impedes adoption of electricity. But of course, I mean, if you would provide electricity for cheaper, for lower costs, it could potentially enable more consumption. We can't rule this out, but at the same time, we believe like by already providing these appliances that are a huge investment, and even if a grant of $1,000 cannot reduce cost barriers in a way that makes the beneficiaries more productive than other activities, because this is in the end what we saw, right? So these new businesses using electricity were not more profitable than the activities that had been done in these villages already beforehand, right? So my prior is that even if electricity was much cheaper, it wouldn't change the story. And then the other question regarding agricultural productivity, I think that's a really good comment. And you might remember that we had in our sample also some enterprises that applied for agricultural processing appliances, right? So we had mills, or we also had, I think, grinders, or I think also some machines for drying agricultural produce. So also these activities are covered in our study. And also here we didn't see impacts on this level.
Thank you very much, Maxi. We have time for the very last question. Okay, so then before closing, after listening to your presentation, I wanted to ask you, after all this analysis, what can be said about what is the decisive bottleneck for these households and small enterprises? Because the results show that people do increase electricity consumption, and there is an intention to purchase and adopt appliances. Nevertheless, these appliances are not as connected to productive aims as expected. So could this be driven by market condition, reliability condition, or people might be suffer from loss aversion, fear of failing in the businesses, or not being able to recover for losses, or any behavioral aspect that might be in play? And I also wanted to ask you whether have you made some zoom at those who adapted like more productive appliances? Were they somehow related with the village leader, or were some like focal people at the villages perhaps thinking of other drivers of adoption?
Right. Yeah, I think these are excellent questions. And I mean, regarding the reasons, we can only speculate, right? So I personally think that the major reason is connection to markets, and yeah, market access to sell produce that is produced in these rural villages. And you were referring to loss aversion. I mean, like with this intervention, we somehow can prove that this shouldn't be a reason, right? So there wasn't any, or at least like risks were reduced substantially. It wasn't their own money that they had to invest in these businesses, and even then, they weren't able to make these businesses grow, at least growing faster than the baseline activities or the activities that the control households were pursuing. So I believe it rather speaks to structural reasons and not so much that the constraints are behavioral reasons. And all right, and then you asked whether we zoomed in a bit more into understanding like who were particularly successful enterprises. And here I have to say that we haven't done this so far. I guess we will see how far this leads us, because our sample is not super big. So I don't think we will be able to do a lot of heterogeneity analyses, but we are definitely planning to explore a bit in how far impacts are different for different types of appliances, or also type of micro enterprises and households. That's definitely planned for the future.
Thank you very much. We are 2 minutes over time, but we have Jose. Jose, if you could ask your question very quickly before closing.
Yes, thank you. This is quite quick. So thank you for your presentation. It was very, very interesting study. I just have some small comments here, because basing on your slides, and I saw that it looks like for Rwanda the universal access is set for 2040. So then it's like a little bit strange, because I think for most of the sub-Saharan countries set for 2030. Then I don't know if there is any special reason for that. And my second point is basically, you said, looking at the project that you evaluated, you say that they gave an amount of $1,500 per village. So it was this amount for which that was for which period, like annually or for the entire period? So then I just wanted to understand this part as well. So then I wanted as well to finish now to just to brush up on the Angela's question about the concept, because usually I think there might be some kind of because when we see this law connection between electrification and development, basically some
The chokes in a row, Maxi. I'm really sorry. I don't know what's happening with the connection.
Yeah, no problem. So I think I heard the first 2 points of Jose's question. Maybe I can already respond to these two. So the first one, why universal access in Rwanda only until 2040? I think if I remember well, they had also been planning to provide universal access to electricity in 2013, but given the progress, I think they updated it to 2040. So I don't think that they were like that they are less ambitious than other countries. I think it's rather the opposite. And the clarification on the amount of money that was distributed. So it was a one-time grant, right? So it was $1,500 that was distributed in appliances, right? And it was clear for everybody that these appliances would be delivered once, and then the idea would be that this would kickstart the development, and no additional rounds of grants were announced.
Okay, Maxi. Thank you very much for your excellent seminar. And on behalf of EFD and SETI, we thank you for your very nice presentation.
Yeah, thanks to everybody for the questions and for being here.
And for resisting the 2 shocks.
Right.
Bye
See you
bye.
soon. Bye bye.
Thank you very much.